It's wonderful to have you all here. It was almost the end of our term and end of the Knowing Africa seminar series for this year. I want to especially note that we are meeting virtually, but some of us are physically on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and that the questions of who is in the nation, who is outside of the nation, who performs in particular ways in order to be included, are issues that have long been unresolved in Canadian history as they are unresolved in other parts of the world. So it's worth noting that these conversations are in fact transnational, and that many groups around the world share very similar kinds of concerns, and hopefully can also learn from each other in the ways in which we create a more just world. This seminar is hosted today by the Institute of African Studies in collaboration with the Pauline Jewett Institute for Women and Gender Studies, both here at Carleton. And we're so delighted to have Jacqueline-Bethel Mougoué as our closing speaker to end this wonderful term of discussions. Jacqueline's book, which I hope many of you have read, and which I have loved, on gendered performances of nationalism. Yay, with a great cover. Someone just texted me to say, wow, what a great cover. This book, in fact, is already won a prize, I'm glad to say. So I'll tell you about the prize in a second. But Jacqueline is a feminist historian of Africa, one of the next generation of rising stars. She's been working on how constructions of gender inform the affect and performances of bodies, of religious beliefs, and of political ideologies. And her work, this book that we're going to discuss is specifically on Cameroon, but her interests go much broader than that. She's currently assistant professor of African cultural studies. I didn't know that was University of Wisconsin-Madison. I didn't know you had a program like that. That sounds fantastic. The book won a prize from the Western Association of Women Historians called the Francis Richardson Keller Sierra Prize for the best book in history. So well done on that, Jacqueline. What a tremendous achievement in the first year and for your first book. Well done. Jacqueline's currently working on a transnational history of the Baha'i faith. And I'm fascinated by this because we have, of course, Baha'i people also in Southern Africa, Jackie, as I'm sure you know. So she's beginning to think about how new post-colonial Black identities are formed through these transnational solidaristic networks. And I want to just add to Jacqueline's amazing profile that she is also an artist and is working on a graphic novel, which sounds terribly cool. So welcome to Jackie, and we look forward to hearing you in a minute. I'm also especially happy to welcome my colleague from down the street, Meredith Toretta, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Ottawa, also a scholar of the Cameroon. She's worked on lawyers and legal activism and rights in Africa. She's the author of Nation of Outlaws, State of Violence, Nationalism, Grassfields Tradition, and State Building in Cameroon. A past president, the immediate past president of CAS, the Canadian Association of African Studies. And Meredith also is one of those academics that I love, who are engaged in real world questions and not merely hiding behind a desk writing brilliant books, which she does. She's also served as an expert witness for asylum cases of Africans in Canada, in the UK, and in the United States. And I know that as president of CAS, Meredith, you also started to take up the issue of Canada's refusal to give African scholars visas, among other things. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to this lovely transnational audience of friends and colleagues from many parts of the world. Jackie, we're going to start with you talking about your book, and then we'll move on to Meredith. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen, for that lovely introduction. First, I want to say thank you to Shireen and to the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University for inviting me and organizing this visit. Shireen and I first met at an African feminist conference at Penn State in the US several years ago, and I was awestruck, and it was really fun meeting someone whose work I really admire. And I also wanted to thank Meredith Tchouta for serving as a discussant today, and whose works I also equally admire. So what I'm going to do is start off by showing you my PowerPoint slide. There was a little bit of a glitch, so I had to actually print out some of the things that I was going to say. So just bear with me for a few seconds while I share my screen, and hopefully I know how to do this correctly. All right. And then now I should be... All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I thought I would spend around 15 to 20 minutes or so laying out the main themes of my book, which was published by the University of Michigan Press in late 2019. Here we have the cover of the book. I did try to get a discount for those of you who might be interested in buying the book, but I did not get.
Sorry, Jackie, sorry to interrupt, but the slide, did you move forward your slide? Because we are still on the beginning slide.
Oh, all right.
I just wanted to make you aware.
Okay, let me see why this is not happening.
It just freezes up sometimes. It's happened to me during lectures before, so hopefully
okay,
it's not a major issue.
All right, let me just try to exit from some of these screens. And let me open this up again. Okay, so let me share my screen again, and let's see if that works. Okay. So hopefully you can see the screen now.
Yeah, try moving forward to see.
And can you see the next screen?
Mm-mm.
Jackie, maybe if you move to full screen and start, there you go.
Okay, so you can see the second screen though.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right.
Now, yeah.
All right, so I was telling you guys a really funny joke and no one understood. Okay, so here's the cover of my book, which was published by the University of Michigan Press in late 2019. Tried to get a discount, but did not get one in time for those of you who were interested. So please email me if you would like one later on. So the book focuses on two main themes, gender and everyday nationalism. I really wanted to highlight how women's everyday, ordinary actions were very much politicized in Cameroon during the 1960s and early 1970s. I wanted to highlight how these everyday actions can play a large role in political movements that are often seen and remembered in history as having male figures at the forefront. So male figures who are usually visible and they are the face of these movements. What I uncovered during the research process when focusing on women's everyday actions and how they can be politicized was that women's roles in political movements are not always radical, and overt, meaning that they're not always kicking down that door with guns in their hands. What I found was that women's roles can be conservative, more subtle, and yet still make a deep and lasting, long-standing impact. The women that I focus on in this work, formerly educated women, female political elites, and the wives of high-ranking government officials, worked within patriarchal confines when trying to achieve two multi-layered goals. In other words, they worked within male-dominated spaces to first advance women's social and political rights, and second, to play a key and long-lasting role in a larger political movement. To be clear, the women I focus on in this book do not label themselves as feminists, but I do maintain that they engage in what some gender studies scholars call feminist actions, so behaviors in which they supported women's advancements and equality in diverse areas of women's lives. I really believe that some of the findings of this book resonate beyond Cameroon and to a more global level. In other words, the research finding might compel us, force us to ask, what are the diverse, invisible, and subtle ways that women have played key roles in political movements, whether that be a separatist movement, where a group of people support the separation of a particular group of people from a larger body on various bases such as gender or religion, or whether that be a secessionist movement, a movement in which a group of people favor formal withdrawal from membership of a federation or body, especially a political state. Thus, Cameroon itself then becomes a nice case study when we can further examine this larger question and analyze the connections between gender and everyday nationalism. Hopefully you can see the pretty maps now. But to better understand how Cameroon could be a nice case study where we can examine the connections between gender and everyday nationalism, I want to briefly outline the history of the country in 10 seconds. Women's efforts to play leading roles in political movements in 1960s and early 1970s Cameroon really began after Cameroon achieved independence from European rule in the early 1960s. Cameroon is a West Central African country that fell under the shadow of European rule, much like other countries in the global South, and from Africa to Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries. But unlike many countries in the global South that were under Western or European rule, two European powers ruled Cameroon at the same time from the early 1900s to the mid-1900s, the French and the British. And this dual rule would cause a lot of problems during the 1960s. By 1961, both the British and French ruled region of the country gained independence. Both regions, once ruled separately by the British and the French, united in October 1961 and officially formed the Federal Republic of Cameroon. And so where we are on this map is we're on the fourth image on the second level there. So we have the part that is red that was formerly under British rule, and the larger, more massive part that is green was formerly under French rule. The unified country comprised of the English-speaking West Cameroon state and French-speaking East Cameroon state. Each state had its own government, laws, systems of measurement, official language, social and financial system, and even drove on opposite sides of the road. In other words, Cameroon at the time was a bit like how Germany was divided into two federal states. Because each state was politically independent, they each had their own ideas about national identity during the 1960s and early 1970s. However, throughout the 1960s, the larger and more powerful Francophone states started to assert a more aggressive stance towards the Anglophone state, which really caused anxiety among Anglophone political elites and formally educated urbanites that Anglophone cultural values, national identity, and political power were really at stake and were really, they were being threatened with their very livelihood. Anglophone elites rightly feared the hegemonic plans of the Francophone state. Thus, in the smaller Anglophone or English-speaking regions, there was really a lot of anxiety about preserving their cultural values and identity. Thus, the main question of focus for political elites were, first, just who are we as a people? Second, just who are we as an Anglophone nation? In other words, what is our specific national identity? And it's at this point that my book makes historical interventions. All right, and here we have, hopefully you can see this, a nice outline of the table of contents from the book. My book specifically focuses on how formally educated citizens in urban regions of the English-speaking West Cameroon states, such as journalists, developed their own ideas about an Anglophone national identity and how women were very important to this political project. Women's everyday actions, I argue, were at the center of developing a strong Anglophone national identity in the 1960s and the early 1970s. And I probe in the work, how did women access these various spaces? In an effort to answer these kinds of questions, my book argues that formally educated women access social and political spaces by invoking embodied nationalism, a concept that I define as a type of nationalism in which identities can be embodied through performance, emotional expression, and visual representations through, for instance, food, dress, and suitable conduct, even how you walk. Within the Cameroonian context, I assert that female educated political elites invoked embodied nationalism to bring visual representations and emotional or affective practices of ideal Anglophone womanhood, mostly within urban spaces. By emphasizing this embodied nationalism, they implied that women's everyday patterns of behavior and comportment, so the clothes that women wore, the foods that they cooked, whether or not they abstained from gossiping too much, and whether or not they stuck to appropriate marital behaviors, such as, for example, not challenging their husband's male authority by chasing or literally beating their husband mistresses out in the open. And these everyday behaviors were important because they really believed that it might project a suitable Anglophone persona, especially in contrast to Francophone or French-speaking Cameroonian women. And I make this argument over what I believe are 7 juicy chapters in the book. And here you have some of the titles of the book, of the chapters. And one of my favorite is chapter 6, My Husband Stopped Maintaining Me, So I Beat Up His Girl. Jealous housewives, women extremists, and public conduct. When my book was went first under review, one of the reviewers said, okay, the first half of the book sounds great. It's clear how women's political actions are visible in women's organizations and so on. And it's clear how women are really being active in this movement. But the second half of the book, which focuses on women wearing slacks and chasing their husbands' girlfriends, it's not so clear how it's connected to this larger political nationalist movement. So the idea about embodied nationalism really started to take root at this point. I was responding to the reviewers' actions or the comments in terms of how can women's everyday behaviors, ordinary actions, how can they be part of this larger nationalist movement? So the idea about embodied nationalism really allowed me to better connect ideas about gender and everyday nationalism together. Within the Cameroonian context, using the concept of embodied nationalism really allowed me to make key conclusions about how women exercise social and political agency during the period of focus. So I made several conclusions looking at their everyday actions through this lens. First, to be clear, the formally educated women that I focus on deployed conservative gender constructs to produce Anglophone separatist nationalism, seeking to preserve Anglophone identity and values, both within larger patriarchal cultures and also within the Francophone dominated republic. Thus, women did not openly criticize the government in Francophone Cameroon. They left this to the men. Instead, women participated in a more conservative, subtler politics that advocated for women's political importance by focusing on their roles as good mothers, wives, and daughters at home, society, and nation. Female members of the political elite linked ideal womanhood to nationalist politics by calling for unity and by underscoring proper gender norms, such as they would have these national cuisine projects that they would put together, and the female journalists would write columns in the newspapers, actually posing these large questions such as, what is our national costume? What is our national food? Women write in a really ironic and funny way. It was often men writing in saying, well, our national cuisine is this, and I think our national costume should be this. So through all of this, they called upon their mutual Anglophone heritage, such as calling for participation events such as British Week, which ended with a Miss British Beauty contest, as a way to really reinforce and tie themselves to former British rule and to this larger British heritage, but one in which it is Africanized. So here we have the cover of what would at the time be known as the National Cuisine Book, written by Auntie Kate. So Kate Ndu was a government official who really advocated domestic sciences. I mean, she was known as the wizard of domestic sciences and being the perfect housewife. And so she started this project in the 1960s in which she would encourage women in various domestic science centers to cook traditional food, but also be selective in the type of Western food that they cooked. So she often gave advice about when to cook very traditional food and when to cook Western food like, pudding. So here's the cover of her cookery book. And female journalists were really also focusing on quote unquote native dishes in their columns. And they would admit themselves, I don't know how to cook any of these foods myself, and shame on me, I should also learn. And so they would be telling their readers, I'm going to be collecting recipes from you, from aunties, from grandmas, and I'm going to post them. And I myself am going to try to cook them on a weekly basis. So we have Auntie Clara, who wrote Our Native Dishes in 1961. And then later on, she said, continuing our native dishes. And as you can tell, this image is from the archives, and sometimes some of the things that I were digging up were not always fully intact. And so in 1968, there's this large Miss British Week event. It's a week-long sort of celebration of British culture, of Anglophone Cameroonians also having this British heritage. And so they would have British representatives who would be there. All sorts of events would occur. They would be playing golf, they would have cooking contests, and of course it would always end with a beauty contest. So this is the winner for 1968. And here are a couple images from the archives that are really focusing on women's national costumes. So you have on the on what would be on my right-hand side, I guess, I think it's your left, we have a female journalist, and so rough onesie. And so she would always be posing these questions of what is our national costume? And then we have Anna Fancha, who is the wife of the vice president of the Republic, who was from the Anglophone region, and she's encouraging women to accept and use their national costume, even though it may cost a lot of money. So the second conclusion that I drew by looking at women's everyday actions through embodied nationalism was that leaders asserted the apolitical nature of their women's organizations. And these organizations legitimize male-dominated political parties by essentially showing openly deference and political support. The conservative patriarchal cultural construct that these elite women used, establishing themselves as good women, despite their, I would say, very subtle political activities to build and maintain Anglophone separatist nationalism, were indeed effective. For instance, by claiming to be apolitical and thus appearing non-threatening to male-dominated parties, women's organizations successfully, although gradually, developed their own initiatives and various projects of social reform that essentially expanded women's access to formal education, the professional workforce, political careers, and even massive access to organized sports. And here we have an image of the women's organizations that are just, they're at the heart of conversations for many of these newspaper columns. And the newspaper columns that I'm showing you are often ran by female journalists who were really addressing issues about women's domestic lives, but then infusing topics about politics in there, about which political candidate to support and which female political candidates to also go out and have support for. And so this idea about women's organizations also filtered out to young girls who are the future of the future mothers of the nation, that they should also be involved in their own girls' organizations. So the third conclusion that I drew by looking at these women's everyday actions through embodied nationalism was that women pushed back against these ideas about how women should behave. So formally educated women and women of middle to upper middle class positioning regularly challenged gender norms to shape their own ideas of a cosmopolitan womanhood. From the housewife who took her husband to court for failing to provide food money, to the female boxer who won a match against her male opponent. After the match, she informed a journalist, quote, what a man can do, a woman can do. She dared any woman who, quote, thinks she can contest my rights as a boxer to box a match with her. And here you have an image of her essentially winning this match, and the report for this match are very incredibly detailed, and it was reported that after the match she didn't look like she was sweating, she just looked like refreshed and ready for her second match. But many urban elite women and men condemned the behaviors of such women who seemingly did not conform to their ideal of Anglophone womanhood, and contrasted this ideal with women in Francophone Cameroon, who they deemed not to be true Christians, or those who were very moral, those who dated around a lot before marriage, and wore Western clothes and weren't as pious as they believe Anglophone women should be. As several of my informants and shared during oral interviews, they perceived Francophone women as being physically aggressive and domineering. And by the way, I am from the Francophone regions of Cameroon. So whereas they're telling me about all these ideas about women from that region, it was a very interesting interview process and experience. These moments of public debate about what it meant to be an Anglophone Cameroonian woman were crucial to the formation of a national identity. By urging women to subscribe to everyday patterns of behavior and comportment that supported Anglophone national politics, female political elites essentially set Anglophone national identity against a more powerful Francophone state. And I wanted to show some more images from the archives that just provided a bit of a taste about how women really fought back about these ideas about what ideal Anglophone womanhood was. So you have female journalists who dedicate their lots of columns to condemning housewives and single women that they feel that are not they're not sticking to these proper gender norms. So we have Sister Dolly, who writes this article about "I frown at women extremists." So women that she really believes that really push the boundaries of gender norms. Ruff Ronzi provides a detailed report about how women have gotten very aggressive and they're attacking their husbands at night and so on. And so in her detailed report, she's saying, women, you should not be behaving like this. And more specifically, housewives, you should not be challenging your the male authority in such a public way. We have men who are also writing into papers, and they're asking, should educated women be acting in a certain way? For example, should wife slap husband first? I know some of these sources, it might seem a bit jarring, but these are very real conversations that they're having and very real fears that particularly formally educated women are really challenging gender boundaries in symbolic ways, but also in physical ways. Sister Dolly, once again, loved writing about housewives who she thought were too extremists. And so in this other issue, or in this other column, you know, she's just going on and on about how housewives really essentially need to control themselves and shouldn't be out on what she calls the highways, chasing down their men and trying to, you know, openly condemn them for certain behaviors. And another way in which women challenged these ideas about ideal womanhood was through their clothing, and through their also other beauty rituals, such as wearing wigs and using makeup. And here, Ruff Ronzi, she's writing about, you know, what are the dangers of societies when women wear slacks. Essentially, one of the arguments that she makes is that when women wear slacks, they might feel that they now are literally wearing the pants in their marriage and in other domestic spaces. But she does argue that that women can wear slacks, but only in certain spaces, such as playing lawn golf. I don't know who at the time is actually playing that, such as going on, like, you know, on leisurely walks, doing sporting events, but they shouldn't wear slacks for going on a date with a man because that might threaten his manhood. And here are just excerpts from this particular article when she is literally saying that the future of West Cameroon, or of the Anglophone regions, is at stake if we don't stamp out certain illicit behaviors that women practice, such as wearing slacks. Men also feel that women's clothing rituals really threatens society at this time. We have a man, Charles Nangwa, who writes in a lot. He writes in, I would say, probably on a weekly basis about women's fashion and what they should be wearing and not wearing. And in this brief a bit that he writes in 1970, he writes, you know, women took over men the wearing of trousers and shirts. Women tend to be interested in men's affairs more, but the men are simply not interested in their own. How will the men look like when they too wear blouses and skirts, frocks and gowns? And he goes on and on about how essentially Anglophone cultural values and the nation is at stake if women wear slacks. And the women who often did not adhere to ideal gender norms were often seen as, or often pinpointed as, free girls or free women. The connotation is essentially being that they're free from male authority. And in the papers and also in interviews with me, people were very eager and happy to share who they thought a free woman was. So someone who had a very harsh attitude, someone who went into bars, a space that was mostly for men, someone who was highly educated but did not follow certain gender norms. And so we have this one example from 1971 where a man writes and he's like, okay, I know what a free girl is, and this is who she is. She scares away men by her attitude, and men don't want to actually marry her. They drink in a very, they dress in a very deplorable manner, and and they smoke and so on. And so what ends up happening is that the very clothing that women are wearing, such as slacks, or the very beauty rituals that they're engaging in, such as wearing wigs and makeup, really is seen as such a threat to cultural values that there starts to be this systematic removal of free girls or free women from urban spaces. So as you can see from the cover of these newspapers, they're just really splashy, like mass sweep on free women begins, time probes the free women's menace, 5,000 free girls start journey home, and home is the rural spaces, and free girls and women were identified by their comportment and by the clothes that they wore. Apartment landlords started to issue ejection notices to women that they thought were free. Free women were banned from hotels in certain spaces as a way, essentially, to really try to control women who are challenging ideas about gender norms at this time and what the ideal Anglophone woman looked like. So to conclude, the case of Anglophone Cameroonian embodied nationalism and its deep connection to gender and everyday nationalism is not connected to Cameroon. In highlighting the strategies women use to navigate a turbulent political setting, my work provides insights into women's roles in separatist and secessionist projects across the world, such as in Quebec, Puerto Rico, and Tibet. Tibet, for example, holds a Miss Tibet competition in India that has become a space to debate proper comportment and the embodiment of Tibetan nationalism and separatist ideology. Closer to home, I lived in Texas for about 7 years. And while I was living there, my students there were always saying that I was not a true Texan, and that Texas is indeed its own nation. And my knowing response was that many Texans do indeed themselves invoke a form of embodied nationalism that is reflected in their comportment, such as in these images that you see, don't mess with Texas, sort of this, we are a really strong people. And also reflected in their sartorial practices and ideas about gender and everyday nationalism. And we can see this in other states in the US, as well as in other countries around the world. These examples suggest that everyday nationalism, or a form of embodied nationalism, often emerges as a channel for tangible markers of national and cultural identity in political, social, or religious movements, where individuals seek to claim and preserve authority and agency across time and space. Thank you, and I will end there.
Thank you, Jackie. I feel like we need to do a transcontinental study of systole, because we too have a systole writing in African newspapers in South Africa. So this is really interesting as a figure through whom a certain kind of person is stabilized as the ideal citizen. So thank you, Jackie. I'm going to hand over to Meredith now.
Okay, thanks very much. That was excellent. And thanks very much, Shireen, for giving me the opportunity to read this wonderful work. I actually hadn't had a chance to read the whole book yet. So this is, I'm really glad to have had this. It's nice to be back at Carleton again also, as I so often am. This is the second thing I've done at Carleton just this week. So, so it was so much fun to read this book. I mean, there's so many clever and funny anecdotes that bring you into each chapter. Some of them Jackie alluded to, like the wife who tried to lock her husband's mistress in the house when she came home and discovered her there, and then admonished her to do the washing up and the household chores. You know, and every chapter sort of brings you in by starting off with a story like that. And as I reflected, you know, pondering what I might say today, I was thinking over what makes this book really different and innovative, because something really made it seem innovative to me. And I realized that, I mean, just taking the historiography of African women, this book really stands out because of its focus, its unapologetic focus on an elite class. And so it sort of follows this elite class of women across various post-colonial media and milieus, through material culture, print culture, social interaction, public and private behaviors and expressions of self. And all of this constitutes a practice of nationalism that, as Jackie just explained, she calls embodied nationalism. And so for those of you who may not be as well versed in the historiography of African women, we have histories of African women as political leaders, whether in early or colonial African history, as rank and file political activists in the proliferation of post-war political parties where politics are explicit, as freedom fighters and resistors in the liberation era, as farmers and laborers, as wives and daughters in royal households, as wives mobilizing colonial era legal pluralism to their advantage to divorce in the courts, as spiritual congregants, whether Muslim, Christian, or traditional religious communities. And so all these portrayals and analyses of women appear in the literature, and yet we don't have a focus as much, not an extensive focus that's really situating women within the context, the historical context of their locale. I can't really call one of those to mind. I'm sure we have a large audience, so somebody's probably going to point one out to me. But that's really what seems most innovative to me about this work, because it touches on many of those elements that I just mentioned as sort of constituting the historiography of African women, but it tacks a different course. As Jackie explained, you know, she cordons off urban, educated Anglophone women in post-colonial West Anglophone Cameroon, where only 2.3% of teenage girls had any secondary, technical, or post-secondary education, in a place where only approximately 14.5% of the population resided in towns and cities. So the analysis is really generously of about 1% of Cameroon's population, maybe a bit less, something like that. So, but Jackie persuades us that this fragment of West Cameroon's population nourished a strong and clearly defined Anglophone Cameroon nationalism in a political arena where the 1966 shift to a single-party state dominated by the Francophone regime in power meant that political expression of nation building took other shapes, dress, other forms, cooking and demure behaviors, celebrating an ideal femininity, and used other words, you know, perform a public submission to your husbands for the good of the nation, writes Dolly as one example of a columnist. So I did wonder, Jackie, about, then I'm going to shift into more critical engagement. I think I have 3 points in that category after really praising this work for its originality and its contribution. I did wonder about your choice to bookend your history with references to the late 1950s Anglo protest of imposed agricultural regulations led by women farmers. So that's in the introduction. And then in the conclusion, you take up takumbeng, a form of protest led by, I mean, traditionally, historically, menopausal women who disrobe to shame those violating moral norms. And I like the way you explain how these traditional forms of protest have been repurposed over time and even diasporic in the case of the latter. But in the meat of the book, I didn't see any bridges or connective tissue linking elite women's construction of nationalism with traditional expressions issuing from mostly rural, unschooled women. So it's almost as though the elite women who are your focus intentionally set themselves apart from the traditional, the rural, the uneducated. Not all the traditional, of course, because they've selected a few and taken things out, and you do show that. But in another sense, you know, insofar as the traditional equates with the rural, there's sort of, were they not sort of looking down their noses, you know, in some ways at the rural unschooled women? And if so, how does this inform our understanding of the Anglophone nationalism you're analyzing? And just to put, you know, to put it bluntly, is this really a story of classism more than nationalism? So moving on to my next point of engagement. So I'm reading this book, and it's written in such a lively, fun, and, you know, sometimes humorous style. And in reading it, I just had this recurring memory of my own visit to the Bamenda Hills of the Western Grassfields in the Northwest Anglophone region, and where I was guided by sociologist Francis Nyamjo, and we visited an artisans cooperative together. And Francis took a photo of me at one of the workshops, standing in front of a handwritten sign that stated, "Non-political, please." So this is almost 20 years ago, to tell you, just to situate it historically. And I still have that photo, and I even thought about sharing it with the audience today. But it says prominently, "Non-political, please." And this memory was resurfacing constantly as I was reading through the book. And it left me with a sort of uneasiness about performing the apolitical. That is, as you argue, as Jackie subtly argues, you know, the apolitical is actually political, right? And so she characterizes elite Anglophone Cameroonian women as laying the foundation of Anglophone Cameroonian nationalism. But the present day Anglophone crisis, which most contemporary observers, who are, by contemporary observers here, I mean not scholars, but journalists, NGO types, policymakers, you know, people who are thinking, what can we do about Cameroon now? They claim that the Anglophone crisis began only 4 or 5 years ago, right? And that makes me want to read this history backwards. By that, I mean, thinking about how this strong nationalist undercurrent that informed so much of everyday life was perhaps something of a ticking time bomb that would one day mobilize an explicitly political and explosive expression. So if the single party state left no room for Anglophone nationalism to enter official political channels, where instead of insisting on their own agendas and goals, Anglophone politicians mostly accommodated the regime in power, where did the nationalist sentiment of those early post-colonial years go? What did it do? Where did it fester? Because that was another recurring word. As I was reading this, fester, festering, it's got to be festering somewhere. If it's not finding, you know, a legitimate political expression. And this brings me to the next point I want to make, where I just indulge myself a bit by taking up your reading of my book, because you do reference Nation of Outlaws, State of Violence, my book on the Union des Populations du Cameroun, or the UPC, nationalism that unfolded in 1950s French Cameroon and then crossed the border and flourished for a time in the British Cameroons before the UPC leadership were forced into exile when the British proscribed the party, as the French had done just 2 years before. And the state's heavy-handed repression, by here I'm talking now about the post-colonial state, the independent Cameroonian state, their heavy-handed repression of UPC nationalism took place in the first post-colonial decade, the same period that is your focus, and the violence of the repression, assisted by the French army and French intelligence, of course, and the narrowing of the political space to a hegemonic single party resulted, I argue, in the state's failure to become a nation. But contra this argument, you write in your introduction that the fact that Anglophone Cameroonian nationalist rhetoric and secessionist and separatist tendencies have never truly faded complicates my argument that the state failed to become a nation after Cameroonian independence. You suggest instead that Anglophone nationalisms demonstrate the, quote, vibrant counter-nationalisms that flourished even as single-party state rule occupied the political arena. But I don't see our arguments as contrary at all. In the conclusion, you write, quote, "The problem of the Cameroonian state to establish a unified nation is much deeper than an Anglophone problem." And I find that our arguments actually converge in that statement, in your conclusion, because in recounting the exclusion of Anglophone nationalist sentiment against the backdrop of Anglophone Cameroon's political and economic marginalization, you too are recounting the state's failure to become a nation. So today, the nation of outlaws state of violence mechanisms that I theorize in my historical analysis, it seems to me, fit the contemporary Cameroonian state's position vis-a-vis Anglophone nationalism, just as it did the Cameroonian state's treatment of UPC nationalism back in the day. In 2016, the heavy-handed state has characterized the Anglophone teachers and lawyers who first launched the peaceful strike to protest the imposition of French language instruction in the schools and French language proceedings in the courts as outlaws, as it did the journalists who attempted measured coverage of those events. So do we not have a nation of outlaws, you know, facing a state of violence once again? And shifting gears slightly, and this is the last thing that I'll have to say, I wanted to ask you whether you've taught this book in any of your courses or seminars on women, gender, and culture in Africa. And I'm curious about that because I can imagine doing so. And I can't anticipate how some students might react. I think students might find it challenging to surmise that, as you conclude, this history exhibits Anglophone Cameroonians' unity and power. I think they might get more caught up in some of the ideas of, say, advice columns written by women about how to overlook your husband's infidelity by reminding yourself that you're the woman he chose as his wife, and being sure to entice him to come home by preparing delicious and irresistible foods. I think they might get caught up in, for example, one of the columnist's choice to be in a polygynous marriage, in her offering a sort of marriage counseling for making polygynous marriages work. So how do you convince your students that something that appears to advocate women's submission to the men in their lives is actually about women's power? How do you talk to them? How do you talk your students through, these portrayals of infidelity, polygyny, and the apparent subordination that goes along with many of the points that you're raising? So that's all. Thanks very much. Let's dig in, everyone.
Thank you. Shireen, are we going to take more collective questions, or do I just answer?
Well, I mean, while people are raising their hands, you might want to respond to Meredith. I'm also especially interested from a teaching point of view, how we get across to younger students the speaking in code thing, where they're so used to a different kind of mode of kind of right on politically correct language, and so on. How do you translate what it is to speak in code politically? Yeah.
Thank you, Meredith, for these really great comments. And you brought up a lot of great points. And so I think what I'll do is I'll try to address them in order, but it seems like Shireen really wants me to answer the point about teaching. And so I will just begin there. No, I have not assigned it to my own students, because I'm still of that generation that's figuring out, is it okay to assign our own work? And make our students buy our own book. I'm still on the fence about that. But I have assigned in individual chapters of the book, and probably shouldn't be saying this on a recording, but photocopied it, rather than make them buy the whole book. And so when I assign the individual chapters, I have an idea of what I want to, or what main messages I'm trying to convey. And so the point about, in terms of, at the end, I'm making this argument about this long-lasting Anglophone political power, and students might be focusing more about, housewives chasing men and so on. And so what I often do is I often start out with, one of my favorite sociologists, Nera Yuval Davis's work, Gender and Our Nation. And so we actually begin right there, and about, and of course, the the Yuval Davis's quotes from that book that are often cited time and time again about women being the authentic voices of their culture, and often seen as being the true representatives, right? And so this really impacts how women are seen in terms of how they behave. And how they engage with politics and also within domestic spaces. And so the chapters on women's organization, that's an example for how women engagement with politics is tied to that larger idea about women being the authentic voices of their culture. And then so one of the chapters about the housewives or the clothing, that's an example, another way of looking at how the idea about gender and nation are very much intimately tied together. And I think one of the main things I try to get my students to think is, as we often talk about, our personal lives can be very much political. And so I think they're often thinking, oh, politics is about organizations and being in parliament and running for government. They don't often think, oh, like the very clothes that I wear can be politicized, how I wear my hair. So more and more they're acknowledging that hair is a space in which we politicize beauty, rituals, and identity, and so on. And so that's one way in which I've used the book, but only chapters. I'm not advocating, use only chapters, but I just haven't assigned the entire book yet. In terms of, when I'm bookending the history, Meredith has said I talk about the Anlu Rebellion and Kampong, and that this is really a story about classism more than nationalism. What are the elite women's connections with these traditional expressions, and really how does this really inform what these female political elites are doing? And I really wanted to talk more about it in the actual book, but it became one in which I really needed to focus in on the main characters or the key figures who are the female political elites. But one of the things I was trying to show is that these women of their generation are coming from cultures and societies in which it's very normal for them to see these traditional women's organizations, and yet because of their education or who they are married to, they are forming or they're being part of these very formal women's organizations that are often tied to male-dominated parties. And so one of the things I was trying to say is that the way in which women operate within the realm of politics is something that has always women's political power has always been there, and it's taken shape in very different ways. And so I didn't really want it to be seen as, okay, all of a sudden these women are engaging in formal political organizations and just sort of forget the traditional organizations, that it's just, I didn't want the stories to be separate. And also these women's organizations, or the traditional ones, are still around. And the advice that the female journalists are giving, or how they remember history, is often tied to the traditional women's organizations. And a lot of the advice they're giving, for example, they're saying, okay, don't chase your husband's mistresses out on the street or beat your husband and so on. But then they say, okay, but if he's not paying for food or paying for certain things, absolutely you have every right to chase him down and to physically assault him or to take him to court. And so a lot of that sentiment is coming from the traditional women's organizations that have these moral codes of, okay, men and women can do this, but a husband beat his pregnant wife. All right, all of us are going to get together and all shame him. So they're overlapping, and even today, when I think about the women that I know in Cameroon, they're part of formal women's organization and part of a ton of traditional organizations. And a lot of their sentiments or understandings about power overlap in these two areas. About classism, I actually I do think that you are right. I do think that it is very much a story about about classism as much as it is about nationalism. Because to be frank, who are the women who are coming up with ideas at this time about what ideal womanhood is? It's women of a particular social positioning and class. And so this is why a lot of the arguments or main points that I'm saying are really only in the urban spaces. They're not, you wouldn't, I mean, really go out into the rural spaces and ask these like certain women, okay, do you think this is how women should be acting and so on? They're gonna have their own idea. And so it really is these really politically elite women or really politically connected women who are driving this movement, but then using traditional mechanisms in order to expand their power base, I guess I would say, at this time. For example, traditional dancing, women would get to gather and do local dances to gather massive numbers, 300 and 400, which is something that a lot of women do in the traditional groups. Performing the apolitical and the idea about the ticking time bomb, absolutely. Yeah, this was very much a ticking time bomb when, especially, I mean, I don't know about you, Meredith, but I get really annoyed when we have contemporary conversations about Anglophone nationalism or West Cameroon nationalism or Southern Cameroonian nationalism. It's, oh, this is something that came around in the 90s, or, you know, or it's just, for me, it's like, okay, this has really been around for a long time. And it's been, like you were saying, absolutely correctly, a ticking time bomb. Where did the early nationalist sentiments fester? And I would say that I'm thinking that you're meaning fester after 1972, when it, you know, when the Federal Republic dissolves. That is actually a really great question and something that I wanted to definitely take up within a sequel, but really focusing on the men, because so many people were like, okay, you talked about the women so much. Can you just also like look at what the men are doing and look at it through a gendered lens? And it definitely festers after 1972, but in a different way, in terms of, and I say that what we think of in the Cameroonian national imagination in English-speaking regions of what Anglophone national identity is something that essentially in many cases, I mean, I don't know if this will get me in trouble, was manufactured by these politically elite women. And it continues on in people's imaginations about what is Anglophone national identity. And I assert that it's not the male political parties that keep this idea about what Anglophone national identity is, which many men get upset with me about, because these groups, the male-dominant parties, they dissolve. It's really the everyday actions and everyday ideas about nationalism that the politically elite women were talking about and also engaging in the 1960s is what survives today. If we think about, you know, the clothing or what the national costume is, you know, the particular fabric that's black and with the bright and red colors. These are women that said, let's have a competition and let's figure out what national costume is going to represent us. And people submitted drawings, people submitted names, and they had a competition and they chose the winner. And from then on, it was, this is our national costume. Wear this during Christmas, wear this during Mass, you know, wear this for like marches, you know, and in today's imagination, I think there's this sort of conclusion or understanding that these ideas about identity were very much reinforced by male political parties. It's really the everyday mundane things, which that I believe are the most powerful political tools. In terms of about nationalism and nation of outlaws and just ideas about the Cameroonian state failing to become a nation, I really do think that there really was not a failure in Cameroon becoming a nation. But I do think that this Anglophone problem has challenged really this idea of we are one people, we are one nation. I do think that there's multiple ideas of nationalism in Cameroon. And most recently, my cousin was telling me about the K nationalist movement that's resurging back. That's Cameroon with a K, connecting it back to German colonial rule, saying the British and the French are the one who divided us. We're one people under German rule. Sort of this nostalgia for German heritage is sort of coming back again. And I do think that the problem has been is that it's a region, it's a country with diverse people, and because of this dual colonial rule or European rule, it has complicated ideas about this hegemonic sort of national identity. And I do think that there is room to recognize multiple forms of it, but we're sort of, as you know, Meredith, looking at the news, it's very heated moments now. And yeah, so I will definitely leave it at that. Thank you so much for your great comments and for your challenging questions, which always make me think. And I'm definitely going to be thinking about your comment about sort of this apolitical and the ticking time bomb and the nationalist sentiments festering after 1972, because this is where the men come in with sort of their nostalgic idea about this golden age.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I just want to say, but for nationalism, I never saw nationalism as hegemonic either. That's why I think that maybe we converge more, because it seems like they're fragmented nationalisms that don't, and competing, you use the phrase competing nationalisms, I would agree with that, but they don't find expression. I mean, if you go and look what's happening in Francophone Cameroon, it's not because the guy in charge is Francophone that they think they won, you know, their vision of nation has been enacted. So just this rejoinder, and I'll now be quiet and and we could talk more.
I know we're running out of time and people need to go and teach or go to class.
Okay.
But I want to take two questions.
Okay.
Two people patiently waiting, Bate and Lindsay. So Bate, are you there? Do you want to unmute yourself? There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
Maybe turn the camera on if you want.
Not really, thank you. So my question is this: the author in our conversation labeled the actions of educated women as being feminist actions. So my question is, to what extent do these actions by this set of women make it to be called feminist in nature, considering that they were somehow authored by their husbands and for the purpose of their husbands, and not necessarily inborn from them in order to bring change and transformation for other women?
Thank you, Bate. I'm going to take two more and then you can answer them together if you don't mind, Jackie. So Lindsay Erisman, I think you're next.
Hi, thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I am a huge fan, of course. I have two questions, if I may. The first, so you're talking about this, you're framing it as nationalism, but I'm wondering to what extent it's actually transnationalist. I work in Uganda, another Anglophone part of Africa, and a lot of the things that you were talking about, Alicia Decker, I don't know if she's still here, she could speak to this better than I can, but in terms of dress and how women should behave, these are very familiar, even in Uganda. This is not, I don't think, unique to Cameroon. What seems unique is that in Uganda, it's men imposing this on women, and in Cameroon, it seems women are sort of perpetuating these ideas. So I wonder if there's any dialogue, or are they being informed by other parts of Anglophone Africa? And then the second is not, I was also interested in the connection between sort of traditional forms of feminism and the ones that emerged in the 1960s in Cameroon, but also just even, I'm interested in audience, right? So where women are constructing ideals of womanhood are in newspapers, English-speaking newspapers, and so people who are uneducated, women who are uneducated, aren't reading them, right? I assume. So who is their audience? Who are they trying to craft this idea of ideal womanhood to or for? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And then Blessed Ngwe, is that the right pronunciation, Blessed?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I am Blessed Ngwe. I am a Cameroonian student, a PhD student in the University of Colorado in Boulder. I just really want to thank you very much for priming the woman's place in defining Anglophone nationalism and the Anglophone nation Cameroon. I also really am glad with Dr. Toretta's reading of your work. The thing that I'm I know this book is set in a particular era, but I just wanted to know within the context of the Anglophone conflict in Cameroon right now, how would you place this embodied nationalism as important to the solving, of the Anglophone conflict that we have today? How do you think these ways that our women, our mothers have embodied who we are, how do you think these ways can be used to cast us differently and to address the conflict that we have today in Cameroon?
That's a really great question.
So, Jackie, I'll let you, I mean, there's a lot of great questions.
So I'll just
answer those, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So Blessed Ngwe, yeah, thank you for that really great question. And so in the book, one of the things I really emphasize is that by looking at these actions through embodied nationalism, we learn new things in history. And so I would give you the same answer to what's going on with the conflict today. By looking at what women are actually doing, we can actually recognize that women are indeed politically active and to perhaps be listening to them more. So, you know, we have the traditional women's organization right now in Cameroon who are active, who are saying, men, listen to us. Moral codes have been broken. Alarm, 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 listen to us. Why do we not have a seat at the peace solving table? And they're saying this time and time again, women should be at the table to be discussing these issues and for the issues to be resolved. And so it's this, so if we look at that through that lens, we can definitely see how active women are being, and also through their physical comportment and bodily actions. You know, they're stripping naked. The post-menopausal women are stripping naked, and they're saying we have serious political grievances about what is going on. Young women are responding, and they're not exactly posing naked, but they're responding on Snapchat, on Twitter, whatever social media there is out there, posting pictures, and they're saying, listen to us. And they're doing this in various ways, and I find it very fascinating today. And for me, the example today is of the situation in Cameroon today is a great example of how, like in the 1960s, women continue to be very politically engaged and active. And I think we should just be paying attention to that right now at this moment and not, you know, looking back in a book. Lindsay, transnationalism and dialogue, absolutely. These women are definitely borrowing from Anglophone regions of Africa to infuse ideas about women's organizations. Not only are they doing that, but they're traveling there. They're going by bus, they're going by planes, they're attending women's organization conferences in Kenya, in Ghana, in South Africa, at a time where, you know, most women were not that mobile, let alone going across the continent. Like Meredith pointed out, we're talking about a small percentage of women, but they are indeed talking to the other women. And they're actually sometimes even saying, for example, Nigeria has this women's organization, why don't we have one, right? Then they send a representative there who goes and researches and does interviews, and they come back and they say, okay, this is how it's set up there. Let's try to replicate that or definitely tweak it. So absolutely. So this idea about nationalism, it works on different levels, but one way in which they're sort of advancing women's rights and so on is through these transnational continental connections. We often talk about these women's connections to the West, but they're highly connected to each other on the continent as well. The audience to these politically lead women, they had a vast audience, and how they reached this audience really differed. And so for formally educated women, it's the columns, it's the women's organizations, and they're encouraging women to go and to send their daughters. You're not a good mother if you don't send your young daughter to this women's organization. For the rural spaces, they actually go on tours, and they call them home tours. Because the men get really frazzled when they see the women going on these tours, and they're being political, you know, they're engaging in politics, and the women are like, no, these are home tours. I'm just visiting people's homes, just like a mother would visit her kids. And as they're visiting these people's homes, they're saying, go to this organization, send your daughter to school. Here is the different ways you can get access to funding to send your daughter to school. And so this is one way in which they would reach women beyond urban settings. They would do tours, and Anna Fansha, the wife of the vice president at the time, went on many home tours, and there would be detailed information about her visits in newspapers, and also transcribing her speeches and so on. I am sorry, I lost who is, Bate. What was it, Bate? Yeah, so the author termed women's actions as feminist actions. To what extent do these actions make them feminist in nature, considering that they were somehow authored by their husbands and for their husbands? Bate, really great question. And so one of the things that I go into a little bit more in the book is that this idea about feminism looks really different within the African context. It's not the feminism that we think of completely in the Western context. And so this is why I agree with gender studies scholars who use the term feminist actions and not feminism, because the women themselves are not saying that. A couple of them say it later on in their lives, or their children actually say it, that their mom didn't want to embrace that that actual term. But I use feminist actions because their ideas about gender equality may not look the same as it does in the US context, for example, or the North American context. A lot of times it is complementary. A lot of time it is one in which it's connected to maternal power. And as mothers, we have access to X, Y, Z. Here is our list. And so it looks different within the African context, which is why I say feminist actions. And in terms of it being authored by their husbands and their husbands, they are doing this within male-dominated societies, but they're very clear that they want to do this on their own. And in meetings, they'll tell men, we don't need your help. We got this, right? We've been part of politics for a really long time now in very different ways. We know what we are actually doing. And so these feminist actions, when I'm looking at the stats, the numbers of young girls going to school jumps up, women entering the professional workforce. And they're doing this in a way in which they don't want to threaten men's power. And like Shireen has shown in her own work, sometimes women's organizations purposely choose to sort of, you know, show a little bit of deference to male-dominated parties because it means money. They get funded, they get lots and lots of money, and they're using it to advance women's rights, but in subtle ways, in ways that might be like, oh, things are not changing tomorrow, but you know, within a span of time, things are indeed changing.
Jackie, I know that lots of people have to go and teach or go to class, so and there are still lots of questions, but maybe I should say thank you very much.
Thank you for having me,
Jackie, for this wonderful book, which is actually already on my course list. My students have read it. And thank you, Meredith, also for your fabulous comments. It's so special to have somebody as well informed and as theoretically and historically sussed as you are. So thank you very much for this conversation between two scholars of Cameroon. Thank you all for coming. This is the last one for this term, but we'll have a whole new list of people next time around, and I hope you'll all join us again then. Thank you, and go well back to wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.